Alright, let's continue where we left off. Sandra. Yes, ma'am. Sandra looked alertly past Mrs. Snell's hat. Aren't there any more pickles? I want to bring him a pickle. He ate 'em, Sandra reported intelligently. He ate 'em before he went to bed last night. There were only 2 left. Oh, well, I'll get some when I go to the station. I thought maybe I could lure him out of that boat. So we're already talking kind of foreshadowing. We already foreshadowed a little bit about the incident of him hiding on, or kind of hiding away and being quiet and withdrawn. So obviously foreshadowing is part of the literary elements, so we can consider that she has to lure him out of the boat, so we're thinking about foreshadowing of future events that she might have to deal with later on in the story, which we already know is what's going to happen from our read-through yesterday. Boo Boo shut the refrigerator door and walked over to look out of the lakefront window. Do we need anything else? She asked from the window. Just bread. I left your check on the hall table, Mrs. Snell. Thank you. Okay, said Mrs. Snell. I hear Lionel's supposed to be running away. She gave a short laugh. So this, supposed to be running away, is again foreshadowing to the event that we see later on in the story about him trying to run away from pretty much any issues. That's a major theme also, him running away when trouble happens or he's unhappy about a situation. Certainly looks that way, Boo Boo said, and slid her hands in her hip pockets. At least he don't run very far away, Mrs. Snell said, giving another short laugh. At the window, Boo Boo changed her position slightly, so that her back wasn't directly to the 2 women at the table. No, she said, and pushed back some hair behind her ear. She added purely informatively, he's been hitting the road regularly since he was 2, but never very hard. I think the farthest he ever got, in the city at least, was to the mall in Central Park, just a couple of blocks from home. The least far, or nearest, he ever got was to the front door of our building. He stuck around to say goodbye to his father. Both women at the table laughed. The mall's where they all go skating in New York, Sandra said very sociably to Mrs. Snell. The kids and all. Oh, said Mrs. Snell. He was only 3. It was just last year, Boo Boo said, taking out a pack of cigarettes and a folder of matches from a side pocket in her jeans. She lit a cigarette, while the 2 women spiritedly watched her. Big excitement. We had the whole police force out looking for him. They find him? Said Mrs. Snell. Sure they found him, said Sandra with contempt. What do you think? They found him at 11:15 at night, in the middle of, my God, February, I think. Not a child in the park, just muggers, I guess, and an assortment of roaming degenerates. He was sitting on the floor of the bandstand, rolling a marble back and forth along a crack, half frozen to death and looking... Holy mackerel, said Mrs. Snell. How come he did it? I mean, what was he running away about? So that's a really big question right here. What was he running away about? What was the reason? Boo Boo blew a single faulty smoke ring at a pane of glass. Some child in the park that afternoon had come up to him with the dreamy misinformation. You stink, kid. So this is going back to the idea that we show, or we come up with later in the story when we find out why he's running away to the boat this time. That in past incidences, when he's run away, one of the reasons was that some kid in the park told him he didn't smell that great, or he stinks. Which, I think back then they were probably referring to a smell, not like, you stink, like, you suck. So, when he's faced with negative thoughts or actions or anything that he just doesn't like, he chooses to run away instead of talking about it. Which much, actually. While it's also kind of part of foreshadowing, I also want to underline it a little in pink, just so that you guys remember that it can be kind of part of the theme or main idea of the story as well. At least that's why we think he did it. I don't know, Mrs. Snell. It's all over my head. It's slightly all over my head. So even Mrs. Tannenbaum doesn't really quite know why her son runs away, but it has a pretty good idea, honestly. Perhaps she just doesn't want to share it with her employees as well, because she doesn't want to share family issues with them, especially with how they act around her kids and what they say, but we'll get into that later. How long has he been doing it? Asked Mrs. Snell. I mean, how long's he been doing it? Well, at the age of 2.5, Boo Boo said biographically. He sought refuge under a sink in the basement of our apartment house, down in the laundry. Naomi somebody, a close friend of his, told him she had a worm in her thermos bottle. At least that's all we could get out of him. Boo Boo sighed and came away from the window with a long ash on her cigarette. She started for the screen door. I'll have another go at it, she said, by the way of goodbye to both women. They laughed. Mildred, Sanders still laughing, addressed Mrs. Snell. You're going to miss your bus if you don't get a move on. Boo Boo closed the screen door behind her. So you can obviously tell by the fact that every time she says something, Mrs. Tannenbaum, Boo Boo, if you will, that the employees kind of see the humor in it. And while Mrs. Tannenbaum doesn't really correct them and maybe even wants to think that she's joking, she's obviously very serious about the situation, because, her son is running away every time he faces issues, which is a terrible habit to have, and especially started at such young of an age. So it's really worrisome for her. She stood on the slight downgrade of her front lawn with the low glaring late afternoon sun on her back. About 200 yards ahead of her, her son Lionel was sitting in the stern seat of his father's dinghy. Tied and stripped of its main and jib sails, the dinghy floated at a perfect right angle away from the far end of the pier. 50 feet or so beyond it, a lost or abandoned water ski floated bottom up, but there was no pleasure boats to be seen on the lake, just a stern-end view of the county launch on its way over to Leach's Landing. Boo Boo found it queerly difficult. Let's go over the fact, you guys might be like, oh my gosh, queerly, does that mean, gay? No. Just like gay in a lot of older writing doesn't mean homosexual, it means happy. Queerly kind of means weird. So it doesn't mean have any homosexual backgrounds or anything, it just means kind of weirdly difficult, or kind of weird or strange. The sun, though not especially hot, was nonetheless so brilliant that it made a fairly distant image, a boy, a boat, seeming almost as wavering and refractional as a stick in water. After a couple of minutes, Boo Boo let the image go. She peeled down her cigarette army style, and then started toward the pier. It was October, and the pier boards no longer could hit her in the face with the reflected heat. She walked along whistling Kentucky Babe through her teeth. When she reached the end of the pier, she squatted, her knees audible, at the right end, and looked down at Lionel. He was less than an oar's length away from her. He didn't look up. "Ahoy!" Boo Boo said. "Friend, pirate, dirty dog, I'm back." So this really goes into her characterization as a mother, at the very least, that of how much she really loves her son and how she wants to connect with him as much as possible. So she's trying to get on his level, but also playing along with sort of a game that she thinks that he might go along with by pretending, to maybe be a pirate. And then later on she's talking about being an admiral, a vice admiral of a ship. So still not looking up, Lionel abruptly seemed called upon to demonstrate his sailing ability. He swung the dead tiller all the way to the right, then immediately yanked it back into his side. He He kept his eyes exclusively on the deck boat. So this is also a really good characterization right here of Lionel. One, the fact that even at 4 years old, he's trying to prove himself, and also that he kind of does demonstrate a sort of sailing ability at such a young age, which is very mature, and also the fact that leads back to the fact that even from the age of 2.5, he's been running away from his problems, which is kind of an adult concept. Adults running away from their problems. It's something that is a lot of times learned over the years, not something that's just, innate at 2.5 years old. So it kind of goes back to his maturity and the fact that he kind of has to mature quickly. And going into their names, the Tannenbaums, they're Jewish. And we'll even go further into that in a second of why he was upset. But this is post World War II, after, the Nazis were defeated, if you will. But there was still a lot of racism against Jewish people, even in America, even after all the hardships that they went through and being revealed all that the Jewish people went through during World War II times. So this is what really shapes the story as well. The fact that he is a young boy, who is a young Jewish boy nonetheless, who is living in America, and while we were on the Allied sides, we were against the Nazis and against what they were doing to Jewish people. At the same time, there's still racism, and some people still have it, just like they still have it today in America against different races. So he was a Jewish kid growing up post World War II when that was still really active, and he's seeing that from a young age, that he's going to be judged for being Jewish, and therefore, or at least being judged for who he is, and maybe not knowing that it's because he's Jewish, and therefore he's maturing quickly, and he's also kind of building up these defenses of running away from his issues at a younger age. So let's get back to the story. "It is I," Boo Boo said, "Vice Admiral Tannenbaum, Nee Glass." Nee Glass means that when someone says their last name and then Nee Glass, it means that their maiden name was what the name is stated after Nee. So, my mother's married name is Musin, and her maiden name is Wire. So she would introduce herself, if she was doing something like this, as Vice Admiral Musin Nee Wire. So that's what that is. "Come to inspect the Sturmafors." There was a response. "You aren't an admiral, you're a lady." So there's kind of that racism there, obviously, sexism there, with, you can't be an admiral, you're a lady. So even the fact that even though he's judged and she is judged for being Jewish, in this time it's like, ladies can't be admirals. So he's kind of going along with another set of issues that is sexism of that time. His sentences usually had at least one break of faulty breath control, so that often his emphasized words, instead of rising, sank. Boo Boo not only listened to his voice, she seemed to watch it. "Who told you that? Who told you I wasn't an admiral?" Lionel answered, but inaudibly. "Who?" said Boo Boo. "Daddy." Still in a squatting position, Boo Boo put her left hand through the V of her legs, touching the pier boards in order to keep her balance. "Your daddy's a nice fella," she said. But he's probably the biggest landlubber I know. It's perfectly true that when I'm in port I'm a lady. That's true. But my true calling is first, last, and always the bounding—" "You aren't an admiral," Lionel said. "I beg your pardon?" "You aren't an admiral, you're a lady all the time." There was a short silence. Okay, I'm gonna pause it here because the video is almost done recording, and then we will go into part 3, and probably a part 4, unfortunately. So please stay tuned.